going to lose the global reserve currency. That is an absolute certainty. When we do, we're going to be subject to devaluations because our trade deficit is $550 billion a year. I'm expecting that we're going to get a 30% devaluation, followed by another 30% 6 to 8 months down the road, followed by another series of 20% devaluations. So that after about 4 or 5 years, we're going to be suffering roughly an 80 to 90% devaluation of our new dollar.
Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Jim Willie. Jim is the editor of the Hat Trick Letter. You can find it on goldenjackass.com. That's goldenjackass.com. He is highly regarded as one of the leading experts on the gold and silver market. He is also highly regarded for his forecasts on currency-related collapses, bank defaults, predictions for gold and silver prices. And I am very happy to have him back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Jim, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Oh, it's good to be back. I remember being on in early August, and we were looking forward to a number of events, and some of them just haven't seemed to happen, but we're in a collapse mode right now, and I think, I really think the epicenter in Europe is Deutsche Bank, and the epicenter in the United States has nothing to do with finance and has everything to do with the Clinton Foundation. So, interesting points of collapse. In Asia, maybe it's the Abe administration in Japan that's the point of collapse. So, very interesting times, Dave. We're witnessing history. We're witnessing right now attempts to salvage the U.S. as a republic. That's my interpretation.
You mentioned Deutsche Bank, and you mentioned a couple things right off the bat here. But with the European banks, with Deutsche Bank, with the Italian banks, there are many out there saying that, these banks, they're ready to go under. They're underfunded. They have a huge derivative book, and it looks like they're not really doing well. Now, the German government, they already said they're not going to bail out the Deutsche Bank. We understand the European Union has their bail-in document where they can go into the bank, but I believe this would cause problems other European banks and depositors if they just start, going in and taking people's funds. From what you're looking at and from everything that you researched and from your insiders, what is happening with Deutsche Bank and the European banks right now?
They've been dead for quite a while. I like to explain as a preface the quantitative easing, the bond purchasing, which is what I call African-style hypermonetary inflation. We think it's all good. We call it stimulus because we in the West are sophisticated. It's nothing more than African, highly destructive policy on the monetary side. When Lehman went down in 2008, September of 2008, which I forecasted a month in advance, by the way, these big banks were all insolvent. So QE was put on as a policy shortly after the Lehman incident. Of course, it was 3 months later, but they immediately went to 0%. And by 0% with the derivatives, you can basically do QE without admitting it. So it's very clever the way the West and the United States does it. But QE enabled the Western banking system to avoid having massive bank failures, because these insolvent structures did not suffer from the loss of liquidity. Okay. Deutsche Bank's been dead for a while, been dead for years. Italian banks have been dead for years. What's happening lately is, and by that I mean the last several months, is that their bonds are getting whacked because the system is providing liquidity for the sovereign bonds, but not so much for the corporate bonds, including financial firms. That's why you're starting to see the Draghi at the European Central Bank. I call him Prince Draghi because he's a prince from the Italian, the Italian elite countryside, and he's got the Goldman Sachs pedigree to prove it. We're starting to see in the last few months movement toward a different policy at the Euro Central Bank and the Fed under Yellen of corporate bond purchases. It's because they've bought a lot of sovereign bonds. They bought the treasury bonds. They bought a lot of Italian sovereign bonds, Spanish sovereign bonds, Portuguese. These are government bonds. They bought a lot of them at the Euro Central Bank. And what they've been neglecting is the big banks. Now, the big banks were kept floating for a while because they owned a lot of these sovereign bonds, from Southern European governments. And Wall Street owned a lot of sovereign bonds in the form of U.S. treasuries. But they did not buy the corporate bonds. So now reality is striking with the corporate bonds, and it's now looking like many banks are at death's door. It's not just Deutsche Bank. You could come up with 20 good-sized banks that are all at death's door. Okay, so their bonds are down, and their stocks are down even worse. I don't care that Deutsche Bank is up 10 or 15 or 20% in the last few weeks. My gosh, they have a name for it. It's called a dead cat bounce, but it's also a manipulated kind of a bounce. In order to keep the system rocking and rolling, the Euro Central Bank buys their stock and puts the word out for other institutions to buy the Deutsche Bank stock. So look more closely at, say, Societe Generale in France, that big bank, and you'll probably see they're buying Deutsche Bank stock. So why is Deutsche Bank stock going up? Because the insiders in the banking cabal are buying it. Okay, now let's get more recent. There's an enormous conflict going on. I might have even mentioned it back in August with you. But the conflict is between the German government, it's many parties. The German Central Bank, the Euro Central Bank, the banking regulators, and the Italian banking system, and the Italian government. The Germans want to bail out their flagship, but they can't. They can't because it's too big. There was an audit done, not an audit, there was a financial analysis done, I think it was by Investment Dynamics in the United States, and the fellow came up with an estimate that Deutsche Bank was worth minus 400 billion euros. And he came out with a statement and said that using the same before and after ratios from the same methods that were done on Lehman Brothers, there's a 2.5 to 1 ratio of reality versus the conservative accounting method. So maybe Deutsche Bank is really worth minus 1,000 billion, namely €1 trillion negative. All right, so we have all these major problems with the German banks. The German government wants to bail out some of their small fry banks like Bremen, the Bremen Landesbank. And they're not talking about 70 trillion euros of derivatives with Bremen Landesbank. They're talking about a need for maybe $5 billion, 5 billion euros. Okay, it's just a complete order of magnitude difference. The problem is that if they bail out more than a couple of German banks, they're going to have to declare it a systemic bailout and bail in, confiscate private accounts. They don't want to do that. So they don't do any system-wide bailout. They're talking about doing 1 or 2 bailouts. But the trouble is, if they do 1 or 2, they'll probably do 8 or 10, and then it will be regarded as a systemic bailout, which will force the EU rules again to do confiscation bail-ins of private account. They don't want to do that. They're stuck. And the Italians are saying, all right, whatever you do in Germany, we want the same in Italy because we know you're going to bail out your banks, and we want the bailout here, and we don't want the bail-in confiscation of private accounts any more than you do in Germany. So that's the conflict. Behind the scenes, the German central bank, the Bundesbank, absolutely despises Prince Draghi at the Euro Central Bank. They have an absolute open hatred going on because the German central bank, the Bundesbank, called the Buba, or not the Bund is their bond, but the Buba or Bundesbank, they have been for generations the best central bank in the world, the most responsible central bank in the world, the least likely to do stupid things of any central bank in the world, the most protective of their own economy of any country in the world, the most defensive and effective in preventing inflation than any central bank in the world. That's the German central bank. They hate Draghi and the Euro Central Bank because the Euro Central Bank under Draghi has taken over responsibility by fiat, by force, of the German banks, just because the German banks are in Germany and Germany is in the European Union. So they're pulling rank at the Euro Central Bank, and the German Central Bank doesn't like it. They don't like it at all. So I don't know what's going to happen with Deutsche Bank. I know it's broken. I know it can't be fixed, cannot be fixed. And if they talk about doing something like a 20 billion euro, dollar and euro, it's almost the same thing, very close, 20 billion euro bailout of Deutsche Bank, it won't accomplish much of anything. It'll buy them a couple months, and then they will be back exactly to where they were, same point, in a couple months. So these banks are on the verge of collapsing. There have been some very interesting recent developments, and by that I mean in just the last 3 weeks or so, maybe even a little bit less. The Qataris, Persian Gulf, Arab oil monarchy. They pronounce their country Qatar. I pronounce it Qatar. Forgive me. I've just always called it Qatar. Anyway, the Qataris, 18 months ago, pitched in 2 billion euros to prop up the capital foundation for Deutsche Bank, and they've lost 50% of it. They were on track 3 or 4 weeks ago for pitching in more, and then they decided to pull out completely and sell everything they have in Deutsche Bank. That has caused some chaos. It's not much in the U.S. financial news. It might be in a back page of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, but it should be front page news. Qataris have backed out of Deutsche Bank. Now here's where it gets kind of funny, and on a political side. Qatar is saying, the royals are saying, we don't like the future plan. We don't like the future prospects. We don't like the future restructuring ideas. We don't like anything that we see in Deutsche Bank right now. So we're pulling out. Money is coming out of Europe into Qatar and their private treasuries. Well, isn't that interesting that the Clinton Foundation just moved $1.8 billion into the Qatar banking system? So it looks like Hillary and Bill are managing an escape plan and moving money out of the Clinton Foundation before it possibly is frozen or maybe subjected to RICO laws in the very near future for confiscation under racketeering. Okay, back to Deutsche Bank. They don't seem to have a plan that's going to work. They're not honest with their most recent financial statement where they said they pulled a profit for the quarter. Well, if I were to ignore all my losses and only report my gains, I would show a profit too. So they've done accounting fraud, and they're not doing mark to market. They're getting permission from the Euro Central Bank and maybe even the German banking authorities to lie about their asset valuation. They're not marking them to the market. They've got some energy portfolio loans that are down big. They are benefiting from the Euro Central Bank propping up the Italian government bond and the Portuguese and the Spanish government bond. Since when should the Italian government bond be trading at 1%? It should be over 10. And for the same point, since when should the U.S. Treasuries be trading under 10% when we've got $1.2 trillion deficit that almost nobody is investing in, and we're using Zimbabwe-style African hypermonetary inflation to monetize our debt. So that does not deserve 1.5% to 2%. Anyway, this is all collapsing, and I think we're going to see some events pretty soon that if they continue to prop up Deutsche Bank, they're going to see Deutsche Bank's creditors and investors fall. It's going to be everything connected to Deutsche Bank, and that means the French banks. So I would watch the French banks as a kind of a litmus test, a barometer for Deutsche Bank. It's dead. These big banks are all dead. They're all insolvent. Take away the central bank propping, purchasing of their bonds, purchasing of their impaired balance sheet items. They're all dead. They'd be bankrupt and not just insolvent. They would be in bank failure mode in a week. And I haven't even mentioned, Dave, I haven't even mentioned the narcotics money laundering that helps prop them up.
I think it was in Zero Hedge where they reported that depositors are taking their funds out of Deutsche Bank. I think it was a 13% drop in depositors in Deutsche Bank. And we talk about these banks, collapsing. If or when they do, I mean, what is going to happen? Let's say Deutsche Bank collapses like Lehman. It just goes. What chain reaction, what will happen at that point? I mean, will this go throughout Europe? It'll be like dominoes just continually falling and then finally hit the United States? What do you see actually happening?
The first domino would be the French banks, like I just said. There was a very interesting chart that I put out. I think it was somewhere around the July hat trick letter recently. It's only 3 or 4 months ago. It was what countries, banks, by country, which countries have the biggest exposure to the Italian banking system? And the answer was France, and it took me by surprise because I thought Germany was. If you look at the biggest investors of Deutsche Bank, I would not be surprised. They're all big French banks. They're tied at the hip together. The Germans own 90% of French government debt, and as a result, I think the French own a lot of the private financial firm stocks for the German banks. What would happen? Well, first of all, you said if it died and broke down just like Lehman Brothers, but let's be clear how Lehman Brothers died. All of their asset sales that were done by Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, all the asset sales by Lehman received nothing from JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. They were strangled. It was all extreme, high-level larceny, grand larceny, billion-dollar theft and fraud. Lehman Brothers sold bonds to JP Morgan and JP Morgan gave them nothing, and Lehman Brothers died. They called that a bank failure. I call it robbery and suffocation. Okay, so I don't know how Deutsche Bank would die if they do die. I don't know how. They're propped up by the Euro Central Bank. They're propped up by narcotics, money laundering. How would they die if they die? How would they enter a failure? I don't know. But if they did allow it to die by not continuing to prop it in the ways that they have been for months and months, I think what you would see is all their creditors immediately dying. Big French banks, other big banks across Europe, big Dutch banks. The Germans and the Dutch are tied at the hip. The Germans and the French are tied with debt. The cultural, long-standing commercial ties are with the Dutch, Netherlands. So one of the biggest questions I wrestle with is how will Deutsche Bank die? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. To me, it would have to be from permitting it to go. They just decide, we're going to let it die. We're going to kill Deutsche Bank because we 30 big banks making this decision all have a plan in place to exploit the situation. Namely, they've shorted the stock, they shorted the bond for Deutsche Bank, and they are big, big buyers of their credit default swap. I don't know when this is going to happen. I don't know if it's going to happen. But, you know, when you get moves like the Qataris pulling billions out, this is critical money in the cash side for their capital ratios, critical that increases the risk of their dying. Let me point out another big event in the last month that took place that also attacked the Deutsche Bank liquidity situation, their cash balance sheet. They sold a bunch of their gold derivative book because they have been sitting as counterparty for Wall Street paper shorting for the last 10 or 15 years. Deutsche Bank has been taking the long side. Just look at it this way. Big Wall Street banks, you know, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Citigroup, they short gold with the futures. The price is $1,700. They're pushing it down to $1,600. They short. Who's the counterparty long? It's Deutsche Bank. It has always been Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank has been the whipping boy on the derivative side with respect to gold. So Deutsche Bank's got all these long contracts that lost money. And, you know, roll it over 3 months later, and they roll it into a $1,600 position. 3 months later, they roll it into a $1,500 position. Well, they've got all these losing underwater positions, and they dumped a bunch of these gold longs about a month ago during the week of Chinese, it was a Chinese national celebration week for Communist China in its inception, its birth. Okay, fine. The Chinese were trying to buy the gold derivative book from Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank got a phone call from Wall Street and the London boys saying, dump your long gold position because the Chinese can't defend, they're on vacation. And the gold price went from the 1,300 handle down to the 1,200 handle. That's how it happened. Deutsche Bank dumped. Okay, when they dumped, they're dumping losing positions that cost them more cash. So not only is Qatar moving out their cash, but Deutsche Bank lost more cash dumping gold on the Wall Street orders. Not orders for sale. I mean like orders with a gun pointing at their head. Forced sales, coercion. Deutsche Bank's running out of cash. And You can do a lot of narco money laundering and take your 15% cut and put the cash aside. And that's all well and good in modern Reich finance these days since 9/11. I don't know how long it's going to work, Dave. I think Deutsche Bank's running out of time on its cash balance sheet. And I just don't know how much more time they have. They're on borrowed time as it is. We're going to wake up one day and hear some Deutsche Bank dreadful news, and a patch is put on. Central banks got together with regulators in the German central bank, the Bundesbank, and they've got a rescue plan. It's just wonderful, a rescue plan of 20 or 25 billion euros. They're going to buy themselves another month or two. Oh my gosh. This is not fixable. Not fixable, Dave.
I agree with you. Jim, I don't think this is fixable. I think they're just putting Band-Aids on this to hold it together for a little while longer. Because, we see what's happening all across the world. In the Middle East, with the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, which was just passed, Saudi Arabia, where they're going to hold them accountable for 9/11, which we know in reality this is completely ridiculous. But they're going to allow, people to sue Saudi Arabia for this, what happened to 9/11. Which actually opens the door for other countries then suing the United States for what the United States government has done in other countries.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's kind of a problem with all of this.
Starting with Iraq and the 2.5 million civilian dead victims in what even England admits was a false cause for war. Okay, that's interesting. Hey, here's my quick thought on the law, JASTA laws. The law doesn't just open the door for claims against the Saudi, let's just say trillions sitting in the United States. It opens the door for Saudi defense. In a lawsuit, correct me if I'm wrong, you try to sue somebody, that party has the right to defend himself, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so did the JASTA law create a forum for the evidence of 9/11 to come forward in the court of law with proper courtroom protocol and admissibility into evidence? All the different involvement, say for the Bush crime family, Mossad and MI6 in Britain, I think they opened Pandora's box for demonstrating the culpability of 9/11 by the true parties who did it. The Bush family, Israeli Mossad, and the British MI6. Those are the three parties that did it. So, it'll be interesting to see the first case. I can also think of, the Iraqi citizens might come forward and say, well, we banded together 100,000 victims, and we're doing a class action lawsuit. We've hired a well-heeled Manhattan law firm, and we're suing for $1 trillion. Then you might see Iranian companies come forward and say the entire Iran sanctions were illicit. We can prove it's illicit, and we've got losses that are, say, $200 billion. And we've hired another well-heeled Manhattan law firm. Okay, they've opened Pandora's box for three things: Iran lawsuits, Iraq lawsuits, and a defense by the Saudis on 9/11. The Saudis do have a role of 9/11. Prince Bandar, who's got a nickname of Bandar Bush. Bandar Bush was hired by the Bush family to come up with 20 patsies, those young kids who were supposedly pilots learning in a Florida pilot school where they all screwed up on Cessnas and graduated easily to Boeings. you got to laugh. I mean, it's so funny. Bandar Bush was paid millions to come up with the patsies. They were all Saudis. That is the extent of the Saudi connection, period. That is just about it, okay? And Bandar Bush might get thrown under the bus. Notice how Al-Naimi is no longer the OPEC, the Saudi oil minister representing the Saudis in OPEC. Okay, so there's a change of the guard going on, and I would not be at all surprised if Bandar Bush is tossed under the bus and the Saudis come forward and say, we'll give you Bandar Bush. We'll admit his role in providing the 20 patsies, but we're going to proceed. We're going to proceed with a lot of legal defense, and we've got a tremendous library thanks to the Russian Kremlin, who has been pretty much the international repository for 9/11 evidence. And notice that the Saudis and the Russians are not exactly best friends, but they're better friends than they were several months ago, and they're working together to do things like, very important deed. The Saudis and the Russians have decided on at least public pronouncements of freezing the oil price. No, I'm sorry, freezing the oil output, freezing their output, which results in a freezing of the oil price. And that's why you're seeing the price pretty steady around 50. I wrote about 6 months ago, look for 50 to be the wall of resistance for the oil price, and that turned out to be very correct. And you know, I didn't at the time know all the reasons and factors for why that would be, and I didn't expect the Russians and the Saudis to come up with an output freeze, but it makes sense for them to do an output freeze, or at least to talk a lot about it. It's like they've got their own Fed open mouth policy going on. They've got the Russian Saudi open mouth oil output policy going on, and it's resulted in a frozen oil price. Okay, that's good news for the oil producers. They can plan their budgets a little bit better, but they're all underwater. The Voice made a forecast call with me about a year ago. He said every single Arab oil monarchy would face a regime collapse. That includes Qatar. So I'm talking about Kuwait, UAE. UAE is the wealthiest of all. They've got a rather small population to take care of, a very small social net system, like welfare. But they got these two huge sovereign wealth funds. Well, they're way overcommitted with treasury bonds. But then, you've got Kuwait, you've got Bahrain, and you've got Oman, and they're all big oil producers. Well, they're all way, way over budget on their spending, and they've got losses. You can't cut their oil revenue in half and expect them to make quick adjustments on all their spending that took a generation to build up. They got commitments, they've got obligations. It's just not possible. So they're all running deficits, and the Saudis have a unique way of handling their deficits. They decided to declare war on Yemen and amplify their deficits, which the U.S. government loves because they're buying U.S. weapons. U.S. loves that, and U.S. just recently sold them some phosphorus bombs that the Saudis are using on civilian targets. It's 10,000 degrees burning human beings alive, and the U.S. is culpable for that as war criminal accomplice. So it's getting very nasty. But I believe we're going to see all the oil Arab monarchies fall. And with Qatar, you're seeing them under great strain. And if you're wondering what's different about Qatar than the others, well, it's pretty simple. Qatar has been the leading nation, leading, I don't know what to call it, monarchy, leading sovereign entity in the Persian Gulf with respect to liquefied natural gas. So, Qatar funds ISIS in order to keep Syria a constant war zone, to stop the Iranian gas pipeline from reaching the Mediterranean and the European market. The Qataris block a natural gas solution that probably is 70% cheaper than the Qatari LNG, liquefied natural gas LNG solution, which is a little more expensive than regular natural gas. So we've got these monarchies propping up terrorism in order to block a good solution of Iranian gas. And if you're wondering, well, what's the Syrian war all about, really, Jim? I'll tell you what, it's about blocking the Iranian gas pipeline from reaching the European market. It's blocking even its construction. So in Ukraine, we're blocking the Russian gas from reaching the European market. And with Syria, we're blocking the Iranian gas from reaching the European market. It's called scorched earth. It's not a new policy. The U.S. is a specialist in it.
I mean, you mentioned the pipeline in Syria, Yemen, and we can see throughout the Middle East, the U.S. is having major problems there. Now, when I say problems, I mean that the people in Yemen, the Houthis, they're fighting back. The actual individuals that are in the country, they're not taking back the puppet government. Then we have Libya, where they gave the country a new government. They didn't elect the government. They said, this is your new government. And the people there saying, no, well, we don't want them. And there's a problem there. Then we have Lebanon. We also have Iraq. And every place the United States has gone into where they wanted regime change to keep the petrodollar propped up, they're having problems in each one of these countries, even Sudan. So when we look at this and we see the United States going back into these countries, bombing, bringing more troops into the area, is the United States government losing control of these countries, losing control of the petrodollar?
Well, first they're losing control of the countries. They're losing any kind of alliance with these Arab nations, most of which are monarchies. These countries are realizing that the United States is playing the terrorist card. They know full well what ISIS is. American public doesn't. They're too dumbed down. They're too accepting and gullible. I mean, they don't believe stories like John McCain and his email, Senator of Arizona, his emails directly to the ISIS leaders and his emails directly to the studios that made the fake beheading videos. I mean, I was all over that story. That was so simple. Since when do you behead a person and there's no blood squirting out? My gosh, it squirts out 3 or 4 feet. It's massive. Okay, they're all doctored films. Putin I think it was last September, about a year ago, maybe 8 months ago, there was a G20 meeting, and Putin had a preliminary sideshow of all the money flow that supplied funds for ISIS, and they were primarily London and Swiss banks. Okay, and that's not reported in the U.S. press. So the case is all out there. The Arab nations are all very aware. It's kind of like here, if I want to have an intelligent conversation with someone about narco money laundering, I talk to a taxi driver in San Jose, Costa Rica. They all know about it. American public doesn't know anything about it. Okay, so the Arab Spring, that is the movement, that is the project from Obama to force regime change. They started in Libya, and they didn't mind that the government didn't stick. They don't care about that. They stole 144 tons of gold that never left the London banks. Okay, that's a success story for these banker cabal thieves and monsters. We should start calling them monsters as really what they are. Okay, they moved on and went to Egypt, where I can't remember all the names, Dave, but there was a general, And he was in charge after the U.S. got involved, and now that general is out and they've got somebody else. I can't keep all the names straight. Every country seems to have these shifts and bad guy, good guy, bad guy, good guy, and now all of a sudden everybody is against the United States. There's a tight connection between the Egyptian regime right now and Russia. They're doing trade deals. They're doing nuclear, not bombs, nuclear plant, electrical generation facilities. The Russians are a leader in this area. The company is called Rosatom, Rosatom, as in Russian atom, Rosatom. We lost Egypt because of Obama's Arab Spring. We're losing every single country that we're getting involved with as a result of the Arab Spring. We've lost Iraq because of the Arab Spring. We're going to lose Syria because of Arab Spring. We're going to lose the Saudi ally because of the Arab Spring. Arab Spring is probably the biggest disaster of any foreign policy initiative in the history of the U.S. government. Yet Obama is revered like a rock star by the morons. Okay, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I believe what we're going to see very soon is the annihilation of ISIS in Syria, the unsuccessful defense by ISIS and the United States and Mossad together, Langley and Mossad. That's what's propping it all up and funding it and arming it. Recently there was a big event, pardon me again, there was a big event where the Russians destroyed numerous convoys of ISIS. Just totally wrecked an entire armament rebuilding and truck transport systems. And within 48 hours, the U.S. military dropped 50,000 tons of reinforcements for ISIS. And that's not in the news. But these countries all know, the neighboring countries all know what's going on. All the way down to Jordan, they know what's going on. They know about the drop. The Turkish government, they know about the drop. The Kurd center in Iraq, they know about the drop. Iran knows about the drop. So we're going to see, I think, the annihilation of ISIS and the complete exposure of the U.S. government. By that I mean the Obama administration, State Department, and Langley through the Bush family. Their involvement in creating, funding, managing, supplying, and handling the logistics. Where are the logistics handled? I'll tell you one place. It's a very big center. It's the U.S. Embassy in Istanbul, Turkey. And that may have changed in the last 3 months as the ISIS command center. We're abusing our embassies. It's not just the Libyan embassy that was abused. I believe Ambassador Stevens got in the way when he realized that Hillary, as Secretary of State, the agent for the Obama administration, Hillary was using the Libyan embassy to move weapons for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is very, I think, connected to ISIS. Okay, so it's not just the Turkish embassy for the U.S., it's not just the Libyan embassy, it's almost all the embassies are being abused. They're turning into intelligence centers and underground arms movement centers and probably narco money laundering centers as well. This is so dirty. Anyway, let's move on, Dave. Go ahead.
As this is all happening, one of the reasons why we had regime change in many of these countries was to keep the petrodollar. If the petrodollar disappears, the economy, it really doesn't function anymore. Isn't that correct?
Well, the petrodollar is a de facto standard and foundation for the dollar, and it has been dissolving for the last 2 years.
Because
So yeah, I agree with you. It's the foundation for the dollar, yes.
I mean, are we seeing the end of the petrodollar? Because if the United States can't keep control of these Middle Eastern countries and the puppet governments fall and new governments are erected inside of these countries, it doesn't mean that they're going to be trading in the petrodollar. I mean, most likely they'll probably trade in a different currency, maybe gold, maybe some other type of function to sell the oil. I mean, are we seeing the end of the petrodollar right now?
Yeah, we're moving into a phase very quickly where I think some of these Arab oil monarchies are going to start using in the interim, this is just a way station, a temporary solution. The interim, I think they're going to use the Chinese RMB currency, the Chinese yuan. And I think once the Saudis announce this, the others will climb on board, including countries like Nigeria. And maybe even Venezuela in our hemisphere. Imagine Venezuela taking RMB in Russian sales. Wow. And the RMB gets converted to dollars, and the dollars are used to pay off Venezuelan debt with the Wall Street banks. It's getting very convoluted. But I think we're going to see the Saudis. Actually, I think it's already happened, Dave. I think the Saudis are accepting RMB currency for oil sales to China. They're just not talking about it. Because if they start talking about it and make a big commotion and get some publicity on it, there are going to be some assassinations of Saudi royals by some of our wonderful boys. The petrodollar has been decaying and being dismantled for 2 years. Okay, let me just point to a story. I may be repeating some of the things that I mentioned in August, but they're very important. The U.S. government claimed jurisdiction over UBS and Credit Suisse, two big giant Swiss banks, on tax evasion basis and Iran sanction violation basis. And I believe both prosecutions by the U.S. government were an overstretched example of their authority. The U.S. government doesn't have authority over the Swiss banks. So the Swiss banking system regulators and their government allowed it to happen because the U.S. and the Swiss together went in and stole Arab gold. So the UBS and Credit Suisse stories were all fake. They were fake in order to enable the theft of Arab gold, primarily Saudi gold. Okay, that was 2014, Dave. That's when I think the petrodollar started to see its unraveling, its foundation starting to be removed, like that game where you get, 50 pieces of wood and you start pulling pieces out. Well, you start pulling pieces out at the bottom for the Saudi oil, converted to gold, held in the bullion banks at UBS. The U.S. wanted their hands on UBS's bullion banks, so the prosecution enabled them to gain control. Okay, the next step is the Saudis are making a lot of noises about all their trillions that they don't have access to, held in the U.S. government vaults. This is very ugly. This is trillion-dollar thefts. But the Saudis, they're realizing now in the last several months, and you're starting to see funny little indications. They're realizing that their $3 trillion or $5 trillion in treasury bonds is not going to be made available to them because it's the core for the Exchange Stabilization Fund managed by the U.S. Department of Treasury. The Saudis can't get back their over $3 trillion in treasuries because it's too important as the core for the market rigging mechanism at the Department of Treasury in Washington. Okay, the funny little indication that we've seen in the last few months is that on the Treasury International Capital Report, Treasury Investment Capital Report, I get confused on what the I stands for. Anyway, it's the custodial holdings of Treasury bonds by the U.S. government and U.S. Fed for the foreign entities. It used to be that they would have one item called OPEC nations, OPEC oil producers, or something like that. Now they've separated out the Saudis. And I believe it's an indication for something kind of devious. We're trying to make a statement that the Saudis only own $200 billion worth of treasury bonds. Now, let's get some of the mathematics here straight. Oh, no, arithmetic, because a third grader could do this. 40 years, number one producer in the world for almost 40 years, and all they've got to show for it is a lousy $200 billion sitting in a custodial tick report account. When the Chinese, in just the last 10 years, accumulated $3 trillion. That's your benchmark for comparison. No, the Saudis have about $5 trillion in treasuries, and they've been told, F you can't have it back. Now, here's where it gets very complicated. Kissinger might have told them in 1973, you're going to have to contribute a large portion of treasuries in your petro-recycling to support the treasury bond, to create the petrodollar standard, to keep your kingdom stable, and to keep the dollar stable. The dollar's stable, your kingdom's stable. It's all good. It's all good. But you're going to have to put aside at least $3 trillion over time into our Department of Treasury fund that we use to keep the world safe. The Saudis might have agreed to it. Don't know. I would love to know the details of the King Fahd and Kissinger operating as an agent for the Rockefellers. I would love to know the details of that deal. We're not going to, because we're just mere mortals and we're not criminal elites. It's all going to end badly, Dave.
I mean, we see what's happening with the Middle East that we just discussed, and Russia is in Syria. Now, this, according to General Wesley C. Clark, Syria was one of the countries that we were supposed to have regime change and then eventually go into Iran. That was the last country. But we've been in Syria for, what is it, like 5, 6, 7 years now? And we see Russia is standing in the way. They are blocking all the entrances to Damascus to get rid of Assad. How do you think this is going to play out? I mean, if the United States government, central bankers, the neocons, the elites, they don't get Syria, what happens?
Russia annihilates ISIS, exposes the terrorism card played by the U.S., Israel, and England. That's what's coming next. So Russia is getting in the way. They're also in the way, so to speak, with Ukraine.
Yes.
Hardly in the way. They're more like the scapegoat. Victoria Nuland boasted that it only took $5 billion of State Department money to overturn the Ukraine government, create the Maidan coup, and block all the Gazprom Russian gas from entering Europe. But that has not turned out to be a successful story, because now the Russians have made contract deals with Turkey to make the Turkish Stream. And in a matter of 2 years, that could be up and running with flow into southern Europe. So it's not like Ukraine was irreplaceable. I mean, that's where these Nazis That's what neocons are. They're fascists. They're the Nazis. They're the neo-Nazis. Bush 2 could not have been elected if he said, well, we're Republicans, but we're really neo-Nazis. And there are a lot of Satanists among us. But vote for us because it's all good. No, they wouldn't have been voted if the American public knew what a neocon was. A neocon is a neo-Nazi, a neo-fascist. They destroy everything they touch, and they kill their hosts in the process. Okay, so the Russians are in the way. And, my source, I've got a number of finance economic sources, but I got also one source who's from the U.S. government, from the security agencies and military. I call him Cato. Cato tells me that the Russians have some demonstrations of key, not so much weapons as devices that render weapons as kind of useless. And we saw it in April of 2014. I mean, when people say, "Oh, we can have a wider war, we can have war," I say, well, we started having a war in February of 2014. Where you been? It's called the Ukraine War. Well, 2 months later, there was an incident with the USS Donald Cook, where the Aegis defense and targeting system on the ship was rendered useless by these Russian devices. So they not only have something that's a generation ahead of the cruise missile, it's called the Sunburn and the Onyx. The Sunburn is a generation ahead, and then the Onyx is even better, more sophisticated, more accurate, longer range than the Tomahawk cruise missile. The Russians jammed the Aegis system. And, I think it was because of that the U.S. Navy withdrew their entire fleet from the Persian Gulf about 6 or 8 months ago. They don't want to lose them. And there have been other incidents where the Chinese have used an advanced electromagnetic pulse, EMP, against a U.S. naval battleship. This was an event somewhere around 2009, the voice was telling me about. It rendered the U.S. battleship into junk metal. They had to return to Chesapeake and, take out all their fried equipment. The Russians have a lot of advanced devices. I don't like calling them weapons because they're used against weapons. They're an anti-weapon device, and therefore they keep the peace. The Russians are in the way in Syria, and they're trying to broker a peace. They're trying to broker some kind of a workable Assad regime that can work with the West. And in order to make this work, I think what we need is a regime change in the United States.
I mean,
because
do you think...
the benefit will be peace.
Yes.
Everywhere we are involved, we create a war.
I agree with that. I mean, do you think these neocons are going to go as far as pushing Russia as far as they can get them in Syria to start a war? I mean, we hear reports that, a general saying that a U.S. plane might fall out of the sky because of Russia. Because as Russia continually defeats, and Syria, the armed forces continually defeat the Islamic State, the United States is being pushed back into a corner. I mean, what's the reason for the U.S. to be in Syria if there's no Islamic State? Because that's why they were there in the first place. At least that's what they told the world. But when Russia removes the Islamic State, the United States government, they don't need to be in Syria anymore, right?
The U.S. government never needs a reason to start a conflict. We always can say there are terrorists there. That's a very deep point. The U.S. has a monopoly on defining what a terrorist is. I agree with what you're saying. If the ISIS state is removed, the U.S. has no justification, no valid justification for continuing to be there. What I think is going to happen is all the neighbors to Syria are going to gang up and tell the Americans, we've had enough of you. And that might even include Israel. Israel just cut a very big deal with Russia regarding Gazprom, the Tamar floating platform, huge Leviathan oil and gas deposit. The Israeli government wants Russian cooperation for export revenue. And I believe Russia might say, here's what we require of you. Pull out of your ISIS involvement with the United States, help to expose it and bring it to an end, and let's have peace in Syria. That might be a Russian requirement of Israel in order for Israel to gain the enormous export revenue benefit from the Leviathan deposit, which has its own problems. Palestine has a claim. They got a small claim on this Leviathan project. So does Lebanon. So does, I think, Jordan, but I'm not sure. Okay, I think we're going to see a regime change in the United States that results in a rather profound change in foreign policy. It's very hard to use voter fraud, Dave, to overcome a 40 to 50% deficit that Trump has, that Trump wields over Hillary, who I like to call Hilla-beans. Flies are attracted to her. You cannot use voter fraud to overcome more than, say, 10 or 12 or 15% deficit. You just can't. You can load up 180,000 additional voters in Rhode Island. They're probably, half of them are probably dead people. Take a look at all the new registrations, and you'll probably see that over 95% of them are Democrat. Take a closer look, and you might find a significant number of Africans and new Syrian refugees, all voting Democrat as part of the deal for the illicit import of millions of them. I like just citing Bowling Green, Ohio. Population 700,000. 10 years ago, had a trifling amount of Muslims. But now 10% of their population is Muslim. They want some new mosques to be built. Where did Bowling Green, Ohio arrive at 70,000 Muslims? How did that happen? Right under your noses. From your rock star hero, Obama, and his gay blade boyfriend, Mike, who they like to call Michelle. But those shoulders, damn, those shoulders are just what is needed at Oregon State University in 1983 for the football team. That's where Michelle came from. So we got a clean house, and let's start with the White House.
Do you really think they're going to let that go that far, where they're just going to let Trump into office?
No.
Do you think they're just going to say, oh yeah, you know what? He has the popular vote. You know what? What are we going to do?
I don't know, Dave. I don't know. There's so many options. What do you think they could do to stop it?
Well, I think they would use some type of an event during the election if they see the numbers not going in the direction they want, and it's the numbers are pulling way out of whack of where they can manipulate the election. They mentioned a cyber attack from Russia. They could use that and say, listen, these numbers are fraudulent. We were cyber attacked. Some of the centers were hit, and we're just going to have to stop everything right now.
They can certainly entertain those options, but what I love about the internet and the alternative media is the proliferation of theories, exposed plots and ideas, for false flag and emergency type events. Whatever you see out there as a potential false flag event will not happen because it got exposed in a preliminary fashion. Okay, I want to hear lots and lots of stories about EMP attacks on Election Day so that it will not happen. We now have people going into the preliminary voting areas, approaching the people in charge at the precincts and asking them, can you help me to prevent my vote from being flipped? This is happening in thousands of places. Not likely to happen without all the exposure of the potential method to sidetrack this. Now you've got Cliff High and his WebBot programs, which I have respect for, but beware. Cliff High is not a forecasting resource. He's a monitor resource of what the buzz is out there. And the buzz is a massive Trump landslide victory. I believe, I'm a statistician. I follow polls. I dissect the polls and look for the bias. I monitor differences between supposed fair polls, and when the difference is too big, it means one or both are falsified. Okay, my best guess is that Trump, a couple weeks ago, had a 40% lead, and now it's closer to 50 with all the WikiLeaks revelations. And even people like my father are starting to become aware of WikiLeaks. He doesn't have any internet access. He doesn't use any internet downloads. He doesn't read any internet news from alternative sources. He doesn't have any email account. Yet we have a conversation about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and some of the damage from the recent revelations. Okay, if my father the dinosaur in his 90s is aware a little bit of WikiLeaks, then it's getting out there. My father is like the last element in the string. I don't think they're going to take this lightly. They're not going to say, oh, what the heck, it looks like Trump's going to win. No, what they're going to do, Dave, is they're going to contact Trump, and he's going to make compromises. For instance, he might make a compromise on a couple of things. On the Russian war, the attempt to have a war with Russia, a wider war, Trump might make a deal that we entertain very serious talks and wind down the rhetoric. That's a start. With respect to China, he might make an agreement to put on hold his idea of a 20 or 30% import tax on any outsourced U.S. company product made in Asia and imported into the United States. Put a hold on that idea. Let's talk about it more. He might make compromises to avoid being murdered. Now remember, John Kennedy was killed. They waited 1,000 days to kill him. They didn't even wait 50 days to attempt to kill Reagan. And I believe that Papa Bush was responsible for that. Second month after Reagan was inaugurated, he survived the Hinckley shooting. I believe Hinckley was one of the Langley robots. By that I mean human robot system, shock treatment, programmed, violent. Of course, he's a lone gunman. He's working alone. He's a kook. Right, that's what they produce. That is exactly what the robot program produces. Loners, wackos, violent. Okay, Trump is very likely to get some kind of a reorientation. And he could come very easily to the public and say, look, I've decided that in the interest of practicality and feasibility, we do not want to introduce shockwaves to the U.S. government and the financial system. In order to bring about a peaceful transition for the reset, he's going to be an advocate for the reset, the global currency reset. He's going to announce something like, say, an 18-month transition plan. And it will have the blessings of those groups who would set out to murder him. And those groups will do their dead level best to try to retain as much power as they can. But as soon as you go to the gold standard, these groups lose 90% or more of their power. And I think the gold standard is going to come into play in the form of the gold trade note to be used for payment of shipped products at the ports. They're going to say, we don't want your treasury bills anymore, we want gold trade note. So that's what I think is going to happen with Trump. He's going to, I noticed some changes. He was starting to do well in the primaries several months ago. And then I noticed him talking about terrorism and we have to keep America safe. Yeah. Well, the terrorism largely comes from Langley. So I concluded immediately, all right, they spoke to him. And he's toned it down because he didn't want to get shot during the primaries. So now he's going to do other compromises so that he's not shot in his first year of office. It's practicality. It's survival. He's not going to tell them, oh, stick it up your nose with a garden hose, in your ear with a can of beer. No, go to hell, you guys. No, he's not going to do that. Because they have precedent of killing our presidents. Every single president who was murdered had something to do with honest money or the gold standard. Go back and check out McKinley. Go back and check out Garfield. And you find campaigns to go to the gold standard. They're not shown in our little crappy history book.
So you're saying we're going to get the same as what we have then?
No, transition, I said.
What do you mean by transition then?
Okay.
You said 18 months of transition.
Toward the gold standard.
Okay.
Toward honest payment for trade. Toward a reversal of policy to encourage U.S. corporations to set up industrial shops outside the U.S. in the Pacific Far East and Pacific Rim in the Far East. A transition to get back to a legitimate economy, because once we lose the dollar as global reserve currency, we're going to have a shitstorm, because we've got $550 billion trade deficit per year, because we have a $1.2 trillion federal deficit. We have to finance them both. And in the course of financing them, we're going to have to see a devaluation of our new currency, which I call the new Scheiss dollar. Scheiss is German for shit, refuse, flotsam and jetsam. We're going to lose the dollar currency, global currency reserve. We're going to lose it. We're in the process of losing it. And I think Trump is going to try to bring about an 18-month or 2-year transition period to lessen the shockwave to the U.S. And I said before, just a few minutes ago, the U.S. elite who wants to kill Trump and stop Trump, that group is going to have a great deal of difficulty retaining their power, and I believe they're going to lose 90% of it. That's not the same old, same old. That's not at all same old, same old. We're going to have transition toward the gold standard in trade, banking, and currency. We're going to have a transition toward reindustrializing the United States. Right now, very little information is given out to the 500 companies that are in individual state free trade zones. The majority are Chinese owned. They have big tax breaks on income. They have big tax breaks on property. They're producing. They're all small. Like in, I think it was about 8 months ago, I featured a Chinese-owned copper tubing company outside Birmingham, Alabama. 40% of their output went to China and is an export item. So we're going to see, I think, thousands of companies like this. And a lot of progress can be made during an 18-month or 2-year transition period toward reindustrializing the United States and reversing this horrendous outsource trend that began in the 1980s. It started with Intel moving their chip fabrication plants to the Pacific Rim. It's a disastrous policy, and it was a policy suggested by the Rockefeller Foundation. Why would they do that? To wreck the U.S. economy. Why does the Rockefeller Foundation fund the chemtrails? To wreck the air quality. Why does the Rockefeller Foundation get away with it? Because they control many parts of the U.S. government. Why can't we get them for genocide and treason? Because they run the U.S. government.
So as we go through this transition, like you're saying, this 18 months, for people who are retiring with their pensions, for those people who are working, how does this affect them with the dollar being devalued and everything happening during this transition period?
A very difficult period, Dave, and you cannot sugarcoat it. When we lose the dollar as a global reserve currency, the U.S. must become, like all other nations, struggling to balance its deficits. And we're going to have a terrible time doing it. The result is going to be any new currency. I call it the Scheich dollar. They're calling it the treasury dollar. I mean, people in authority. And by the way, there are dozens of warehouses all along the East Coast that hold these new treasury dollars. They're also being called the rainbow dollar because they're various colors. You look at Canadian currency or even the Costa Rican currency. Here in Costa Rica, a green bill is the 10,000 Cologne note. It's worth about $20. The yellow bill is the 5,000 note, worth about $10. The blue one is the 2,000 note, worth about $4. The red one, we call it the rojo. The red one is 1,000 Cologne, and it's worth about $2. Okay, multicolored. In the United States, for 2 generations, we've had only green bills. We're about to get the multicolored bills. They're going to be devalued. The new dollar must be devalued. The Chinese made some demands a year or two ago with respect to the U.S. government. They said, look, you don't deserve holding the global reserve currency anymore. It's a free credit card. You can't have the rest of the world pay for your economic deficits and your government deficits. This cannot stand. So the Chinese told the U.S. government about 2 years ago, you need a new dollar. It needs to be devalued by 50%. So I'm told by some of my really good sources that a compromise was struck. The Washington officials said, okay, we'll come up with a new dollar. It'll be domestic only. We'll do a 30% devaluation. We'll tell everybody that's the extent of it. But then a few months down the road, we'll do another 30%. So you take 70% preserved value, multiply again by another 70% preserved value, you get 49% preserved value. There's your 50% devaluation. They're going to lie about the devaluation and say that it's the only one. And they might possibly time this 30% devaluation of the new Scheich dollar with some kind of a bail-in where people lose 30% of their accounts, their private accounts. Not just bank accounts, it might be stockbroker accounts as well. I don't know. I'm not in charge. And if you want to find out, just call 1-800-LUCIFER and JP Morgan will pick it up and they'll be glad to answer all your questions. I don't know how this is all going to turn out, but I do know that we're going to lose the global reserve currency. That is an absolute certainty. When we do, we're going to be subject to devaluations because our trade deficit is $550 billion a year. I'm expecting that we're going to get a 30% devaluation, followed by another 30% 6 to 8 months down the road, followed by another series of 20% devaluations. So that after about 4 or 5 years, we're going to be suffering roughly an 80 to 90% devaluation of our new dollar. During that time, we will work vigorously to remove and reduce our $550 billion trade deficit. Until it is reduced to near nothing, we will continue to have devaluations, which will mean the Toyota car that you like, or the Yamaha motorcycle that you like, it's going to cost 2 to 3, maybe later 4 times as much. So people are going to be thinking, I want to buy an American-made motorcycle. And it just might be made from a Chinese firm that opens up shop on American soil as part of a free trade zone. This is how we reindustrialize the country. Okay, that's just import price. Now, when you're a nation, and all you had to do is look at Venezuela. If you're a nation struggling to reduce your trade deficit so you could bring about some stability in your currency, you're going to see everything not nailed down subject to export in order to bring in to the United States, the newest third world nation, bring into the United States what they call hard currency, just like in the other third world countries. So you're going to see shortages. Now, in the free trade zone companies, in the copper tubing export company in Alabama, they're exporting 40% of their output. They're keeping 60% of their output and putting it into the U.S. economy. And that's all good. Okay, my guess is that when we have this problem from the new currency and the big deficit, which must be addressed for reduction, we're going to see a lot more export. We're going to see copper tubing shortages in the United States, just as one example. You're going to go look at the various retail chains like Walmart and Target. They're going to be half empty because we're not going to import things. We're going to do our dead level best to do the opposite, export things. So we're going to see billboards, support your local company for exports to make America strong again. These could be written by Donald Trump's administration. Okay, we're going to have shortages, Dave, because we're going to export everything. Look at Venezuela. They have shortages, incredibly, of rice, beans, toilet paper, and condoms. I know this because I know people who've been there. I know people who read their newspapers. Shortages of staple items. That's what's coming to the U.S. When you see all this, you're going to see the problems with price inflation. You're going to learn, wow, I didn't know that was an export item. I thought that was made in the United States. No, it was assembled in the United States, and it was really made in Japan and Korea. Okay, all those component items are going to go up in price, so you're going to realize that something that cost $10 had 60% of its internal components that were foreign made, and all that 60% component is going to double in price. So the whole thing won't double in price, just the foreign components. Okay, you're going to see shortages, and when all this hits, expect lots and lots of riots and looting and, just a lot of campaigns with angry people. What happened to our America? That'll be one placard. And who betrayed my country? That'll be another placard. And how can we, there'll be other ones like, restore prices, or let's do price freezes. No, you don't do price freezes. That bring about even worse shortages. So it's going to be a very difficult transition. I think Trump is going to try, if he's elected or ever inaugurated, but I think he might make some he's a practical businessman. You think he might have made some compromises to big bankers after he had a bankruptcy? Hell yes. He knows how to compromise, and I think he's already made some. So
Jim,
I think go ahead.
What about the entitlement programs like welfare, food stamps, Social Security when all this is going on? I mean, does the government shut down? None of this can be paid out?
I think they're going to be on a national emergency initiative to cut the federal deficit. I mentioned the trade deficit. I did not mention the federal deficit and how it will be reduced. It will be reduced by cutting back these entitlements, I think, by at least half. Take a look at, for instance, the Central States Pension. It's a private pension fund for a lot of truckers, Teamsters, and you name it, all across the Midwest. They just had a 52% payout reduction for their monthly pensions. That's very typical. Expect the same with the U.S. government. I don't expect to have the same Social Security that I might begin next year when I turn 65. I don't expect that payment to be the same 8 years later like my father's was. My father's has gone up in nominal amount by 2-3% every year. Okay, I don't expect that to happen with my Social Security. I had an argument with my father back in 2002. We got together for a good long week on a vacation, and we had a number of little arguments. I said, Dad, I don't expect to get jack shit for my Social Security. And he said, oh, Jim, what another very silly thing to say. What did my father have to say about my comments regarding Social Security a year ago? Jim, it looks like you're probably right. Okay, it's typical of my forecast. Jim, what a dumb thing to say. 2 years later, wow, how'd you know that? Because I think ahead, that's how. I think ahead. I try to think ahead all the time. I'm trying to think ahead right now for what's going to happen to the Costa Rican civil disorder for when they lose the nice rosy dollar exchange for the Costa Rican colon currency. I'm thinking about moving 3 miles out of town just to be away from the violence. And I'm wondering if a couple of key friends would visit me. Well, yeah, Jim, if you pay the taxi. Okay, we're going to see civil disorder. It's a lock. It's coming. The pensions are going to be one of the factors to cause the civil disorder. Food stamps? I'm sorry, if that's not eliminated altogether, I'll be shocked. I mean, what you're going to do is you're going to see tremendous cutbacks in all the different items for the Obama constituency, the freeloaders, all the people who, in my opinion, should not have the right to vote. If my right to vote is exercised in order for me to get more free stuff, then you have an abomination of the democratic process. And when over 50% of the country is getting free stuff from the government, you have a broken government. You have a broken economy. How about we rebuild it with 10,000 free trade zone companies? That's maybe a stimulus plan that the freaking moron in the White House never thought of because he's too hell-bent on his Marxist crap. His stimulus plan was toward corrupted green energy that he personally benefited from. His stimulus plan was handouts to people that resulted in no capital formation. His stimulus plan was a stark manifestation of his economic stupidity.
So, Jim, what happens to the Federal Reserve? Is that still in existence? What's their role at this point?
Right now, I'm not sure they have much of an official role. I think they have a functional role. Let me explain what I mean by that. There's a lot of reports going out there, and it's not just Benjamin Fulford that earlier this year, I heard about it a year and a half ago, that the Federal Reserve changed hands in controlling ownership and then later became a bankrupt entity. There's indications that the Federal Reserve will not be around much longer. Now, what is its functional role? I don't care right now about its official role. What are they doing? Well, they're printing money and buying treasury bonds like any African nation would do. What else are they doing? Well, they're managing some of the intricacies of the interest rate swap derivative machinery. Like, for instance, the tweak adjustment for reverse repos, the dollar swap availability for foreign countries. I learned about 6 or 8 months ago regarding the BRICS, not the BRICS. You know, the BRICS are the emerging market nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. The BRICS are Federal Reserve export outposts. Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland, Cayman or Caribbean, and Switzerland. These countries, between June of 2012 and the end of 2014, that's 2.5 years, they bought $420 billion of U.S. treasuries. So, can you say that the Fed doubled their QE bond program by enlisting their BRICS outposts? Yes, we exported QE. Okay, these are going to be shut down. When the dollar loses its global reserve currency status, the Fed is essentially put out of business. What's their role going to be? If they're involved now in treasury bond purchases and derivative machinery that results in treasury demand from artificial purposes, what is their job if the treasury bond is in some sort of a 18-month transition for liquidation, dissolution, and retirement? They don't have a job. I think we're going to see a radically new concept of central banks come up, Dave, and I don't have it all figured out. But they're going to be involved pretty much, I think, in the honest brokering of gold from nation to nation. Gold bullion transport. Like two nations, X and Y, have an imbalance, so there's some shipment of gold, and there are going to be some intricacies for sure. Like one country pledges certain natural resources, like say lumber or coal mines or copper mines or something tangible, and they work a contract out with another country, a third party, to provide gold in return for the swapped hard assets, the natural resources. So central banks might be involved in the brokering of that, but I think they're going to be involved for quite some time in the conversion of sovereign bonds, not just U.S. Treasury, but UK gilts and Euro bonds and Japanese government bonds, JGBs. They're going to be involved in 4 major central bank issuances of sovereign bonds for their conversion from toilet paper. That's what their new status would be. From toilet paper to gold bars. And that's where you're going to see a lot of the forced devaluations come from. Central banks announced that, well, in order to facilitate conversion of sovereign bonds from England, we had to reduce the value, we had to devalue the British pound. Why? Because they needed to facilitate the conversion of their toilet paper debt to gold. Everything will be marked to gold. I got a tremendous lift back in March and April this year when I heard through Euroraj that there was a massive conference, not a huge number of people attending, but of massive importance, between the Chinese and Basel Bank for International Settlements, where they were discussing the conversion through an international treaty recognizing that payments for trade and contracts would convert from dollar to gold, and they needed a conversion rate in order to make that happen, and they were talking about a $5,000 gold price. Okay, so imagine the Saudis with information technology and insurance company and lots of different requirements, and it's provided in Saudi by an Indian company, and it would be at $1 billion a year. Well, that contract set in stone with the dollar would be converted to gold using the rate of $5,000 per ounce of gold. The Saudi-Indian contract would be converted by means of the international treaty. Well, why would Basel and the Bank for International Settlements represent the Western world? Well, because they control the central banks. Notice all the Basel rules. Basel I on capital and internal trading. Basel II, Basel III on capital requirements for healthy bank operation regarding their reserves. Okay, Basel makes the rules for the Western central banks, which then make the rules for the local domestic banks. Okay, the Chinese representative, I'm told, was the White Dragon family or society or something like that. The White Dragons, just call them White Dragon. They own 120,000 tons of gold. They want to create the new franchise gold trading system, gold payments, gold currency, gold reserves in banks. They want to set up the gold trading system, and they need an accord, an international treaty with the West. So you have Basel and the Bank for International Settlements, China with the White Dragons, and we might possibly see something. I was told that it was kind of on again, off again. They make some progress, they go away, they try to digest, they come back, they're stubborn, they realize, well, everything's breaking more, no, we need to make an agreement. So they come back together, they make more agreements. Step by step, they're making agreements, and grudgingly, they're going to come up with a temporary, I think, near $5,000 gold price. So that during this transition period, it might actually go up when the U.S. is being reindustrialized. These are exciting times, Dave. If we can just keep the Western elites, the Satanists, the banking cabal, keep them out of the room, we can avoid a world war.
I really appreciate you coming on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
Well, it's been 12 and a half years since I launched the Hat Trick Letter. This month was actually number 151, so
congratulations.
One month more than 12 and a half years exactly. Okay, it's www.goldenjackass.com. It's an irreverent name. My mother used to call me my little jackass because I was pretty disobedient and I had a big backbone. I talked back a lot. I got in a lot of trouble in school when I was young. It's kind of weird being near the top of the class scholastically, you know, with the studies, but at the same time, one of the most disciplined for having a big mouth. But now I've turned, you know, proper channel of the big mouth into podcasts. So anyway, it's www.goldenjackass.com. There's a free area in there. It's for public articles, and I've been pumping out some more public articles recently than in quite a while because we're in climax mode. But in addition to free public articles, there are free podcasts, these interviews, and I try to always put a public link for the interviews, and I try not to repeat an interview with someone if in the last episode the host did not provide me a link. So I do continued interviews with people who provide links for my clients and my followers, and I don't even know how many followers there are. There are quite a few, I think. So there are 2 newsletters that come out each month, and this is the purpose of the website. It's to promote the Hat Trick Letter, which is a finance and economic newsletter focusing on gold, currencies, central banks, bonds, and economies. The 2 monthly publications are the Global Money War Report and the Gold and Currency Report. They're really quite different. One has kind of a macro focus with the Global Money War Report, the battles over the dollar, de-dollarization, policies that really undermine the dollar, like QE at the Fed. The other report, Gold and Currency, it's much more street level. It covers China and Russia with the creation of the Eurasian trade zone. It covers oil and the petrodollar, covers currencies, covers mint demand, minted coin demand, covers India frequently because they've got gigantic demand. I mean, Americans just don't realize that they hold 15 to 20,000 tons of gold in their households, like savings. Have a wedding, okay, out comes some more gold, but they save in terms of gold. They've got more than twice as much gold in India now in their homes than we ever did in Fort Knox. Okay, so 2 reports each month, a lot of free material as well, and I always like mentioning my 2 favorite compliments. I listened to your podcast, your free interviews for a couple of years, and I thought that was enough, but I finally signed up for your newsletter. I wish I'd signed up earlier. The other one was, I was a subscriber of yours for a few years, but I left it for 3 or 4 years, looked at some of the other publications out there, and I'm back, and I wish I'd never left. So I invite people to go to goldenjackass.com, bounce around a little bit, look at some things, and sign up for the newsletter, because we are in climax mode. This is the 9th inning. We are in the end game now. The dollar is at its deathbed. The dollar is going to lose soon its global reserve currency status. They're just trying to work out the details because it's so deeply rooted.
Thank you for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. What I'll do is I'll put the links at the bottom of this video. So for those people, all you have to do is click on it. It'll bring you right over to his site. Jim, once again, thank you for being on the Spotlight.
Oh, it's a pleasure being on, Dave. It was a pleasure being on in August, and I hope to be on again.
I hope you will, and I'm hoping to bring you back.
Good. All right. Well, thanks for everything.
Thank you.